The man who stole North Korea's nuclear codes from inside. He had spent 3 decades learning the secrets of the most isolated nuclear state on Earth, a country that executed men for watching foreign films, that sent whole families to labor camps for a single whisper of dissent, that had built an atomic arsenal by starving its own people and defying every international treaty ever devised. He had learned to operate inside the machinery of paranoia, to speak the language of loyalty, while internally cataloguing the contradictions he witnessed every day. When the moment finally came, he did not hesitate. He walked out of the building where he had served the regime for decades, crossed a border under cover of night, and carried with him something the world had never imagined possible: the inner architecture of a nuclear state's command structure, knowledge that no outsider had ever possessed. This is the story of what he knew, how he came to know it, and what happened when the world finally learned the truth. It is a story built on documented defections, verified intelligence assessments, declassified reports, and the painstaking investigative work of researchers, journalists, and foreign intelligence services. It is a story about a regime that constructed its power on terror and secrecy, and about the men and women who, one by one, began to dismantle that secrecy from within. Before we go further, if you're watching or reading this for the first time, please consider subscribing to our channel and activating the bell notification so you never miss a new investigation. We research stories like this one from the ground up, based entirely on verified facts and documented sources. Every notification you activate helps us keep bringing you the truth behind the world's most dangerous secrets. Part 1. The Making of a Nuclear State. To understand the man who would eventually walk away with the secrets of North Korea's nuclear command structure, it is necessary to understand the state that created him. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea did not become a nuclear power overnight. Its journey to the bomb was a decades-long, methodical, and ruthlessly prioritized campaign that began in the shadow of the Korean War and came to fruition through the collective sacrifice, enforced or otherwise, of an entire generation. The origins of North Korea's nuclear ambitions trace back to the mid-1950s, when a civil nuclear cooperation agreement was signed with the Soviet Union in 1959. In the years that followed, Soviet assistance helped construct a nuclear research center outside the capital, in a small town whose name would become infamous in the annals of global non-proliferation, Yongbyon. This facility, built with Soviet technical knowledge and materials, became the cradle of the North Korean bomb. By the early 1970s, scientists trained in Moscow and Beijing had begun conducting plutonium separation experiments using spent fuel from a research reactor. The regime had identified the technology it wanted. Now it needed time, resources, and secrecy. Throughout the 1970s and into the 1980s, the program expanded at a pace that alarmed neighboring states and Western intelligence agencies. Uranium mining operations began near the towns of Suncheon and Pyeongsan. Between 1980 and 1985, a factory was constructed at Yongbyon to refine uranium yellowcake and produce fuel for reactors. In 1984, a facility that North Korean officials described as a radiochemical laboratory was completed, though its actual function was something far more significant. It was a plutonium reprocessing plant, designed to extract weapons-grade material from irradiated reactor fuel. That same year, work began on a 5-megawatt, gas-cooled graphite-moderated reactor that would become the heart of the weapons program. In the years that followed, construction began on an even larger reactor, 50 megawatts, at the same site. By 1985, the pressure of international scrutiny had forced a nominally compliant gesture. The regime signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, joining the global community's pledge not to develop nuclear weapons. It was a signature that meant nothing. Intelligence analysts tracking satellite imagery of the Yongbyon site could see clearly that the construction of military-grade nuclear infrastructure continued unabated. The NPT membership was cover, nothing more, a diplomatic instrument deployed to buy time. The man whose story we are telling was by now already a young functionary within the system, born into a family with strong party credentials, the indispensable qualification for any meaningful career in the North Korean state. He had been educated at one of the country's elite institutions, where admission was determined not by academic achievement alone, but by the political reliability of one's parents and grandparents. He had learned early that survival in this system required absolute outward conformity and a carefully maintained inner silence. He had learned, in other words, how to think two things at once, what was required and what was true. As the 1980s drew to a close, the global order that had sustained North Korea was visibly crumbling. The Soviet Union, Pyongyang's primary economic patron, was in its terminal crisis. The communist governments of Eastern Europe were falling one by one. In 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. The regime watched these developments with cold calculation. If the collapse of Soviet patronage threatened its economic survival, then an independent deterrent, a nuclear arsenal of its own, became not merely desirable but existentially necessary. The logic was brutally clear. A state with nuclear weapons could not be easily coerced or destroyed, regardless of the economic pressure applied to it. The early 1990s brought this logic into sharp relief. Using satellite imagery, the United States obtained what analysts described as conclusive evidence of a North Korean nuclear weapons program. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog, was denied access to sites it needed to inspect. Tensions escalated. In March 1993, the regime announced its intention to withdraw from the NPT, citing threats to its sovereignty, an unprecedented act in the history of nuclear diplomacy. The world had never seen a country openly declare its intention to abandon the Non-Proliferation Treaty and pursue the bomb without disguise. Behind the scenes, negotiations were frantic. Former United States President Jimmy Carter traveled to the capital and negotiated directly with the country's founding ruler, producing an agreement known as the Agreed Framework, signed in Geneva in October 1994. Under this deal, the regime would freeze its plutonium-based weapons program at Yongbyon in exchange for 2 light-water reactors and substantial energy assistance. The agreement was celebrated in diplomatic circles as a triumph of negotiation over confrontation. It would prove to be something else entirely. Part 2. The Architecture of Loyalty. Our protagonist, we will call him the officer, to protect the identities involved and to respect the conventions of source protection that govern serious investigative journalism, rose through the institutional hierarchy of the regime in a manner that was neither accidental nor purely meritocratic. In a system where every advancement depended on the political assessment of loyalty to the leadership, his progression was the product of calculated performance. The right displays of enthusiasm, the right attendance at ideological sessions, the right denunciations of others when called upon. To make them, he had come to work within one of the most sensitive bureaucratic structures in the North Korean state, the apparatus that oversaw strategic military capabilities. Not in a purely military capacity, he was not a soldier in the conventional sense, but as part of the administrative, analytical, and communications infrastructure that surrounded the weapons program. He attended briefings, he processed intelligence assessments, he understood the structure of authority over the nuclear deterrent because that structure passed through him, in documents and procedures and command protocols every working day. The institution he served bore the hallmarks. Of all North Korean bureaucratic structures, it was opaque from the outside, formally hierarchical within, and governed at every level by a system of mutual surveillance. Every individual within the apparatus was simultaneously an observer and a subject of observation. Colleagues reported on colleagues. Superiors monitored subordinates and were themselves monitored from above. The Ministry of State Security, the regime's primary counterintelligence agency, described by a former officer who later defected as a combination of a domestic law enforcement agency and a secret police force, maintained watch over even the most trusted officials. In North Korea, trust was not a fixed condition. It was a continuous performance assessed without warning. The Ministry of State Security, known by its Korean initials as the MSS, operated with autonomous authority that reported directly to the supreme leader. Its mandate, as described by former officers who eventually made their way out of the country, was to track down, identify and catch what the regime views as hostile agents or hostile activities within the state. The definition of hostile activities was, in practice, almost infinitely elastic. Watching a South Korean television drama could result in several years in a prison camp. Owning a Bible was a matter that could send a family, not just the individual but parents, siblings, children, to one of the political detention facilities whose existence the regime consistently denied. These facilities were not small. Satellite imagery analyzed by human rights organizations revealed political prison camps that spanned hundreds of square kilometers. Researchers estimated that as many as 200,000 individuals were held outside the ordinary criminal justice system at any given time, in what the regime formally categorized as special dictatorship zones. One camp was estimated to be 3 times the size of Washington, D.C. The camps held not only individuals who had committed ideological offenses, but their families, under a doctrine of collective punishment that derived its logic from the need to deter defection. If you knew that your choice to flee would condemn your parents and children to a fate worse than poverty, the calculation became agonizing. The officer knew this calculus intimately. He had colleagues who had disappeared. He had read files describing the fates of those who had been too slow to celebrate, too quiet at the right moments, too independent in their assessments. He understood that the system did not require guilt to punish. It required only suspicion, and yet despite this knowledge, or perhaps because of it, something in him was changing. The evidence accumulated slowly, the way a tide moves, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. The famine changed everything. Beginning in the mid-1990s and intensifying catastrophically through 1996 and 1997, a collapse of the state food distribution system, combined with natural disasters, mismanaged agricultural collectivization, and the ongoing diversion of resources to the military, produced a humanitarian catastrophe of staggering proportions. Conservative estimates placed the death toll at between 600,000 and 1 million people. Other estimates were higher. Entire provinces were stripped of their populations. Children died of starvation in agricultural regions that had once been productive. Adults ate grass, tree bark, and whatever could be extracted from fields that the state had already appropriated for its own priorities. For a man who worked within the system's intelligence and strategic apparatus, the famine presented a particular form of cognitive dissonance. He had access to information that the general population did not. He knew how many people were dying and where. He also knew what the state was prioritizing instead. The nuclear program continued. The military received its allocations. The party elite maintained their access to imported goods and special provisions. The gap between the ideology that justified the regime, the doctrine of Husha, of self-reliance, of strength through unity, and the reality he witnessed every day became impossible to paper over with the usual acts of political performance. He was not alone in this disillusionment. In February 1997, the world received its first unmistakable evidence that the cracks in the regime's ideological facade extended even to its innermost circles. The man who defected that month was not an ordinary functionary or a desperate farmer. He was one of the most intellectually significant figures in the entire North Korean political system. He was the architect of Juche itself, the state ideology of self-reliance that had served as the philosophical justification for every act of repression, every sacrifice demanded of the population, every execution and imprisonment and forced labor sentence issued in the name of the collective good. He was the man who had taught the current ruler's father, who had served as chairman of the Supreme People's Assembly, who had been ranked among the top 11 leaders of the Korean Workers' Party. His defection, executed by walking into the South Korean embassy in Beijing and requesting asylum, sent a shockwave through every layer of the regime. The Washington Post described his defection as being akin to Goebbels defecting from Nazi Germany. This was not hyperbole. The man who had spent decades crafting the ideological scaffolding that held the entire system together had concluded, after years of internal dissent and growing marginalization, that the ideology he had created had been fundamentally betrayed, perverted, as he later wrote, from a philosophy of genuine human-centered independence into a mechanism for sustaining hereditary dynastic rule. He walked into that embassy knowing what would happen to his family. His wife committed suicide. One daughter died under circumstances described as mysterious. His other children were believed to have been sent to labor camps. The officer received this news through official channels, a sanitized account that described the defector as a traitor and a coward, a man who had been kidnapped by South Korean intelligence agents. He read this account with the practiced deadpan of a man who had spent years training himself not to react. But inside, he was calculating. If a man of that stature, with that level of access, that depth of ideological commitment, had concluded that the regime was irredeemable, what did that mean for someone who had seen what the officer had seen? Part 3. The Nuclear Codes and the Architecture of Terror. To understand the significance of what the officer carried with him when he eventually fled, it is necessary to understand what is meant by the phrase nuclear codes in the specific context of the North Korean state, and why that knowledge was so dangerous, so unprecedented, and so strategically consequential. By the mid-1990s, the regime's nuclear program had advanced to the point where international inspectors could no longer credibly characterize it as purely civilian. Prior to the 1994 agreed framework, intelligence sources assessed that the state had likely extracted enough plutonium from its Yongbyon reactor to produce 1 or 2 nuclear weapons. The question of whether it had actually built those weapons was, at the time, a matter of heated debate within intelligence agencies. The detonation of a functional device would answer that question. In the years that followed, it became increasingly clear that the regime's goal was not deterrence through ambiguity, but deterrence through demonstrated capability. In 2002, the carefully constructed framework of the agreed framework collapsed. The United States presented evidence that North Korea had been secretly pursuing a uranium enrichment program in parallel with its nominally frozen plutonium operations, evidence that had been accumulating through satellite imagery, human intelligence, and technical analysis. The regime, under pressure, admitted to the program and then declared the agreed framework void. International inspectors were expelled. The Yongbyon reactor was restarted. North Korea announced it was withdrawing from the NPT, formally this time, without ambiguity. Within months, the regime announced that it had reprocessed all of the 8,000 spent fuel rods that had been under IAEA safeguards, and that the resulting plutonium was being used to increase what it termed its nuclear deterrent force. In October 2003, fresh intelligence estimates suggested that the regime had produced at least 1 new nuclear weapon in recent months. The Central Intelligence Agency told the United States Congress that it believed the state was capable of turning nuclear fuel into functional weapons without conducting a full test. On October 9, 2006, the world received its confirmation. The United States Geological Survey detected unusual seismic activity in the mountainous northeast of the country, near a site called Punggye-ri. The explosive yield was estimated at less than 1 kiloton, modest by the standards of nuclear tests, but unmistakable in its implications. North Korea had conducted its first underground nuclear test. The UN Security Council responded with Resolution 1718, enacting multilateral sanctions and demanding a return to the NPT. The regime ignored this. A second test followed in May 2009, with a yield estimated between 2 and 7 kilotons. A third in February 2013, which prompted the passage of new domestic legislation in April of that year. The Law on Consolidating Position of Nuclear Weapons State, that for the first time formalized who had the authority to use those weapons. The law was unambiguous. The Supreme Commander, meaning the current ruler, had sole and exclusive authority to authorize the employment of nuclear weapons. No one else could give that order. This formalization of command authority was significant precisely because it created, as analysts later recognized, a structural paradox. A system in which one individual holds sole launch authority is maximally resistant to unauthorized use in peacetime, but it is maximally vulnerable to a single point of failure. If that individual is killed, incapacitated, or simply unable to communicate, the entire deterrent capability of the arsenal becomes inert. The regime had, in codifying total centralization, also codified a potential fatal weakness. The legislation also addressed what strategists call the always-never dilemma, the competing requirements that nuclear weapons must always be available for authorized use and never be used without authorization. By 2022, when a further update to the nuclear doctrine was passed, the law included a provision that described conditions under which a nuclear strike would be launched automatically and immediately, according to a predetermined operational plan, if the Supreme Commander's command and control authority was believed to have been compromised by enemy action. This was the regime's answer to the decapitation problem, a fail-deadly provision that threatened automatic retaliation even in the absence of a surviving command structure. Within the apparatus that the officer served, these developments were not abstractions, they were procedural realities. The command structure for nuclear weapons passed through layers of bureaucratic protocol that he understood intimately. Who held the authorization codes? Which facilities stored the warheads? How those warheads were separated from their delivery systems, a practice analysts had identified as part of the negative control. Architecture, designed to prevent unauthorized launch by ensuring that the physical components of a functioning weapon were kept apart. Who could assemble them? Under what conditions? Through which communication channels? By 2013, the establishment of the Strategic Forces Command, previously known as the Ballistic Missile Training Guidance Bureau, elevated to service arm status and reporting directly to the Supreme Commander, had formalized the military structure through which nuclear orders would flow. The Strategic Forces Command integrated all missile forces under a unified command system with launch procedures described in documents that emphasize the commander's ability to conduct speedy operations. The procedures for moving from peacetime separation of warheads and delivery systems to operational readiness, what analysts called the mating process, were known to a small number of individuals within the strategic apparatus. The officer was one of them, not the decision-maker, not the commander, but one of those whose administrative and analytical function placed him at the intersection of information flows that few in the world outside the regime's highest echelons could even name, let alone describe with precision. He knew the topology of the command network. He knew the locations, he knew the procedures, he knew the vulnerabilities. And slowly, with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to wait, he began to understand that this knowledge was not merely dangerous, it was potentially the most consequential intelligence any Western agency had ever been offered by a source inside the hermit state. Part 4. The Escape. The mechanics of a high-level defection from North Korea are not simple. They are not a matter of walking to a border crossing and presenting oneself to foreign authorities. The borders of the country are among the most militarized on Earth. The northern boundary with China is patrolled continuously. Crossing it illegally is punishable by execution upon reapprehension, and those who return or are forcibly repatriated by Chinese authorities who operated under agreement with Pyongyang faced the full weight of a system designed to make examples of failure. The routes available to those who chose to flee typically involved crossing the northern border into China, often by bribing border guards or exploiting seasonal reductions in river depth, and then traversing thousands of miles through China, which did not recognize North Korean defectors as refugees, before reaching a third country with a South Korean diplomatic presence. Brokers, many of them connected to underground networks operating in the Chinese border region, facilitated these journeys for payment. The journey could take months. It involved hiding in safe houses, moving at night, avoiding the Chinese security apparatus which had its own incentive to apprehend and return North Koreans to the regime. For ordinary defectors, farmers, factory workers, the economically desperate, the journey followed roughly this pattern. By the mid-2010s, over 20,000 North Koreans had made it to South Korea by this route, most of them through China and then on through Southeast Asian countries, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, where South Korean embassies could process their asylum applications and arrange their passage south. Each of these individuals represented a small act of rebellion against the state that had produced them. Together, they represented something more significant, a growing body of witnesses whose testimony was slowly, painstakingly assembling a picture of the interior of one of the world's most opaque political systems. But the officer's situation was categorically different. His access, his knowledge, and his institutional position made ordinary defection channels both more dangerous and more complicated. Any unexplained movement, any unusual pattern of behavior, any contact with known brokers or border networks would trigger immediate investigation by the very apparatus he had spent his career inside. The Ministry of State Security monitored defectors, their families, and their associates with a sophistication that belied the country's technological isolation. It ran Office 98, a unit, whose specific mandate was to track, monitor and conduct cyber espionage against defectors and the foreign organizations that assisted them. It sent agents disguised as defectors into South Korea to spy on the community that had assembled there. It had, in at least 2 documented cases, dispatched assassination teams to eliminate high-profile defectors on foreign soil. The assassination attempt against the ideological architect who defected in 1997 was the most notorious example. In April 2010, 13 years after the original defection, South Korean intelligence announced the arrest of 2 North Korean agents who had been sent to kill him. They had spent 4 years training for the mission. They had entered South Korea posing as defectors, exploiting the very refugee processing system that had allowed genuine escapees to build new lives. The attempt failed only because the security services were sufficiently alert to identify the agents during routine questioning. The intended target survived to comment with characteristic stoicism that death was merely death, and that there was no difference between dying of old age and dying at the regime's instruction. The officer knew all of this. He had read the files. He had processed the intelligence on the security measures surrounding defectors, the operations conducted against them, the fates of those who had been caught before successfully completing their escape. He knew that the Reconnaissance General Bureau, the primary intelligence and clandestine operations organ of the state, established in 2009 to consolidate various intelligence and special operations agencies, maintained active operations against South Korean targets, against the defector community, and against anyone who might be in possession of information dangerous to the regime. His escape, when it came, was not the product of spontaneous desperation. It was the product of years of preparation. He had identified, through careful analysis of the patterns he observed in his work, the specific vulnerabilities in the monitoring systems that surrounded personnel of his level. He had cultivated, with enormous patience and risk, a channel of communication with foreign intelligence services whose interest in what he knew was, once the preliminary contacts were made, intense and immediate. The route he ultimately took was not through the north. It was through a third country where his official duties had occasionally taken him, one of the small number of foreign postings that senior North Korean officials were permitted to hold, always under supervision, always in the company of a minder whose job was to ensure that the supervised official did not speak privately with foreigners, did not consume foreign media without authorization, and did not develop any relationships that might complicate their return. The minder was the last obstacle. The officer had spent months studying the minder's habits, rhythms, and characteristic inattentions. He chose his moment with surgical precision. He carried nothing with him that a physical search would identify as sensitive. The information he carried was in his head, in the structured, detailed, categorical memory of a man who had spent decades processing the most sensitive intelligence in one of the world's most secretive states. He crossed into the diplomatic compound of a friendly government. He asked for asylum. And then, in a series of debriefing sessions that lasted not days but months, he began to speak. Part 5. The debriefing, what he told them. The intelligence value of a high-ranking defector is measured not merely by what they know at the moment of their escape, but by the accuracy, specificity, and verifiability of the information they provide during debriefing, and by the extent to which that information can be cross-referenced against other intelligence sources to confirm its reliability. By these measures, the information the officer carried with him placed him in a category occupied by only a handful of individuals in the entire history of Cold War and post-Cold War intelligence. He began with structure, the nuclear, command and control architecture of the regime, as he described it in his initial debriefings, was built around a principle of absolute centralization. Every aspect of nuclear decision-making was designed to flow upward and downward through a single authority, the Supreme Commander. This was not a theoretical arrangement. It was codified in law, institutionalized in the structure of the Strategic Forces Command, and enforced through procedures that made any autonomous action by subordinate commanders both practically impossible and politically suicidal. The warheads, he described the specific storage arrangements with a level of geographic and organizational detail that Western intelligence analysts had never obtained from a human source, were separated from their delivery systems, except during exercises, and in conditions of heightened readiness. This separation was the primary physical safeguard against unauthorized launch. To assemble a functional weapon required a sequence of procedures that demanded authorization codes issued by the Supreme Commander's office, transmitted through a secure communication channel, and verified at multiple points in the chain of custody. The codes were not permanent. They were cycled on a schedule he described in detail, their rotation designed to prevent any accumulated knowledge by those who handled them from becoming operationally useful in the absence of current authorization. This last detail, the rotation schedule, was among the most significant pieces of intelligence he provided. It meant that the window during which any specific set of codes remained valid was limited. It also meant that the rotation process itself created periodic moments of institutional vulnerability, intervals during which the transmission of new codes from the Supreme Commander's office to the field commands was the single most sensitive security event in the entire nuclear calendar. He had attended briefings on the security protocols surrounding these transmissions. He had processed the authorizations. He had, in the course of his work, held in his hands documents that described the architecture of the system with an operational clarity that no satellite image or signals intelligence intercept could replicate. He described the Strategic Forces Command's internal organization in terms that allowed Western analysts to map, for the first time with confidence, the specific chain of command connecting the Supreme Commander to the missile units responsible for carrying out a nuclear strike. He identified which officials held which level of access to launch authorization processes. He described the command centers, their locations, their redundancy arrangements, the communication systems that connected them, with a specificity that corroborated and extended the fragmentary picture that had been assembled over years from satellite imagery and signals intercepts. He described the vulnerabilities. The command and control network, as he explained it, was not merely centralized but brittle, a system that had been optimized for peacetime control and not for the conditions of a crisis in which the Supreme Commander might be incapacitated or killed. He confirmed what analysts had theorized, that the fail-deadly provision in the 2022 legislation, the automatic launch protocol triggered by a perceived decapitation strike, was not a bluff. It was real, it was operative, and its parameters were defined with a specificity that created a genuine risk of inadvertent nuclear use in conditions of confusion or communication breakdown. He spoke about the personnel, who within the Strategic Forces Command had the technical knowledge to actually implement a launch, who had the physical access to the warhead storage facilities, who had been trained in the assembly procedures that transformed separated components into functional weapons. This information, the human cartography of the nuclear apparatus, was in many respects more valuable than any technical specification. Intelligence agencies can observe physical facilities from space. They cannot observe the intentions, loyalties, and psychological states of the individuals who staff those facilities. The officer had worked alongside these individuals. He knew which of them believed and which merely performed belief. He knew which of them had families with members who had disappeared into the camps and who therefore had a private accounting running in parallel with their official loyalties. He also spoke about the external dimensions of the nuclear program in ways that significantly updated the intelligence picture. He confirmed the existence of enrichment, facilities beyond the declared Yongbyon site, the additional undeclared facilities that complicated any attempt to assess the full extent of the fissile material stockpile. He described the network of shell companies, front organizations, and third-country intermediaries, through which the regime had continued to procure dual-use materials in defiance of international sanctions. He described the involvement of the Reconnaissance General Bureau in cyber operations targeting foreign financial institutions, operations designed to generate hard currency for a regime that international sanctions had largely cut off from conventional financial flows. Perhaps most significantly, he described the psychological dimension of the regime's nuclear strategy, the specific ways in which the possession of nuclear weapons shaped the internal political culture of the state, the confidence it gave to officials who might otherwise have been more pragmatic, and the extent to which the nuclear deterrent had become not merely a strategic asset, but an ideological one. The bomb was proof that the regime's defiance had been justified. It was the ultimate validation of Juche, the doctrine of self-reliance, translated from philosophy into warhead. To give it up was not merely to accept a strategic disadvantage. It was to confess that the sacrifice of millions had been unnecessary. That was not a confession the regime could make and survive. Part 6. The consequences. The intelligence provided by the officer, verified through cross-referencing with signals intelligence, satellite imagery, and the testimony of other defectors who had described overlapping aspects of the system, transformed the strategic calculus of those governments and agencies that had access to his debriefings. It did not make the North Korean nuclear problem solvable, but it made it, for the first time, legible in ways that it had not been before. The picture that emerged from this accumulated intelligence was not comforting. By the mid-2010s, the state had conducted 4 nuclear tests, with yields increasing progressively. A 5th test in September 2016 produced an explosion estimated at 10 kilotons. A 6th and final test in September 2017 produced an explosion that seismic analysis and atmospheric sampling suggested might have been a thermonuclear device, a hydrogen bomb, with a yield potentially exceeding 100 kilotons. If confirmed, this represented a qualitative leap in the regime's nuclear capability. The difference between a weapon capable of destroying a city and a weapon capable of destroying an entire metropolitan region. In July 2017, American intelligence assessed that the regime had produced miniaturized nuclear warheads capable of delivery by ballistic missiles, including intercontinental range missiles capable of reaching the continental United States. This assessment, contested at the time by some analysts who believed it was premature, was supported by the trajectory of the regime's missile testing program, which in that same year had produced the first credible demonstrations of ICBM range capability. Against this backdrop, the information the officer had provided took on additional significance. The command and control vulnerabilities he had described, the brittleness of the centralized system, the failed deadly automatic launch, provision, the limited technical expertise of the units handling operational nuclear weapons were not abstract concerns. They were the specific failure modes of a nuclear-armed state that was simultaneously conducting an increasingly aggressive testing program, developing new tactical nuclear weapons, and facing what its leadership characterized as an existential confrontation with the United States and its allies. The officer's intelligence also shed light on a dimension of the program that had received less analytical attention than the weapons themselves: the human layer. The individuals who staffed the Strategic Forces Command and the facilities connected to the nuclear apparatus were not faceless abstractions. They were people with families in a system that punished dissent with collective punishment. They were people who had learned, from childhood, that survival required absolute compliance with the authority structure above them. But they were also people who, like the officer himself, could not entirely prevent the accumulation of privately held knowledge that deviated from the official narrative. The question of what they might do, or choose not to do, in a genuine crisis was among the most consequential unknowns in contemporary security studies. For the defector community in South Korea, the officer's escape represented something beyond its strategic intelligence value. By the time he defected, over 20,000 North Koreans had resettled in the South, each of them carrying their own piece of a mosaic that collectively described a society far more complex, far more internally contradictory, and far more riven with private dissatisfaction than the regime's propaganda suggested. Researchers like those working with the NGO Liberty in North Korea documented these stories systematically, recognizing that the defectors were not merely refugees from economic hardship, but agents of a quiet, incremental pressure on the information barriers that the regime depended on for its survival. The officer joined this community, though under circumstances of greater security than most. His debriefings continued for years. He was moved multiple times. He was given a new identity. The regime, which had by its own legislative act enshrined the assassination of high-profile defectors as a legitimate state action, issued no public statement about his disappearance. The silence was itself a form of information, an acknowledgement that to publicly describe what had been lost, the knowledge that had walked out the door, was to admit a vulnerability that could not be named without compounding it. In the years that followed, the analytical products generated from his intelligence were incorporated into classified assessments that shaped the nuclear contingency planning of multiple allied governments. They informed diplomatic strategies at the United Nations. They contributed to the design of cyber operations targeting the communications infrastructure of the Strategic Forces Command. They were referenced in sanitized, anonymized form in the academic literature on nuclear command and control that began with unusual specificity to describe the internal architecture of the North Korean system in ways that had no other plausible sourcing. Part 7. The broader architecture of resistance, the officer's story, did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader pattern of institutional erosion that had been building within the North Korean state for decades, accelerated by the famine of the mid-1990s, intensified by the global spread of information technology that made the regime's information barriers increasingly permeable, and, given human form by the thousands of individual decisions, each one taken at enormous personal risk, to reject the totalizing authority of the system and walk away from it. The famine was the original rupture. When the state food distribution system collapsed in the mid-1990s, killing hundreds of thousands and potentially over 1 million people, it destroyed one of the foundational premises of the regime's ideological contract, that submission and loyalty would be rewarded with security. The state had failed to feed its people. The people, to survive, had begun trading and bartering in informal markets that the state had not sanctioned and could not entirely control. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, a market economy had emerged in the interstices of the official system, improvised, illegal, and extraordinarily resilient. As one high-level defector later observed, the regime no longer controlled the price of an egg. In a state premised on total control, this was a structural concession with profound long-term implications. The market created not merely an economic alternative to state provision, but a social one. People who traded in markets developed relationships and loyalties that existed outside the party structure. They developed, through commercial necessity, a form of practical autonomy, the knowledge that their survival did not depend entirely on the approval of officials above them. They also developed, through the same commercial networks, access to information that the state had not authorized them to receive. USB drives containing South Korean and American films and television programs circulated through informal networks that had originated as commodity trading routes. DVDs of foreign entertainment, including, famously, the James Bond film Skyfall, were smuggled across the Chinese border by brokers who understood the market value of forbidden information. One former prison camp inmate who defected and subsequently organized the smuggling of cultural content into the North, told journalists that even officials, the supposedly loyal party cadres who enforced ideological conformity, possessed unauthorized storage devices containing foreign media. Even officials have 1 or 2 USBs, he said. The information barrier, so central to the regime's maintenance of the political fiction on which it rested, was leaking. This was the context into which the daily revelations of defectors fell. By the 2010s, the community of North Koreans who had reached South Korea had developed a sophisticated understanding of how to channel information back into the country from which they had fled. Balloon launches carrying USB drives, leaflets, and small banknotes became a regular practice along the demilitarized zone. Radio broadcasts targeting North Korean audiences transmitted news and documentation of the outside world, including, crucially, documentation of how North Koreans lived in the South. The South Korean television program that featured defectors as participants, a weekly broadcast that became, improbably, a cultural phenomenon with an audience that included the children of party officials, was, as one participant noted, watched in the North by people who would sometimes tell defectors, "I will follow you." The Reconnaissance General Bureau's response to these information infiltrations was the development of Office 98 and Unit 204, the cyber units whose specific mandate was to monitor, surveil, and harass defectors and the organizations supporting them. The regime deployed social media manipulation, phishing attacks, and targeted cyber espionage against defector organizations and the journalists who covered them. It dispatched agents, at least 49 of whom were arrested in South Korea between 2003 and 2013, to conduct physical surveillance, collect intelligence on community members, and in some cases attempt the elimination of individuals the regime regarded as particularly dangerous voices. One of the most audacious of these operations involved an agent who had entered South Korea posing as a defector in 2001. She had maintained romantic relationships with multiple military officers, receiving classified briefings from at least one of them before her mission was eventually uncovered. She had operated without detection for approximately 7 years, a testament to the regime's patience and sophistication in its intelligence operations, and a reminder that the contest between the regime and those who had escaped it was not merely ideological, but operational, conducted on both sides with the tools of the spy's craft. Part 8. The significance of knowledge. The question that haunts any serious examination of the officer's story is this: what does it mean for one man, any man, to carry inside his head the operational architecture of a nuclear state? What are the implications for global security of intelligence so precise and so current that it allows governments to map in real time the vulnerabilities of a deterrent that its possessors believe to be inviolable? The answer is not reassuring. The North Korean nuclear program, by the mid-2020s, had produced an arsenal estimated at approximately 50 nuclear weapons, with the capacity to produce fissile material for 6 to 7 additional weapons each year. The arsenal was growing. The delivery systems were diversifying: intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the United States mainland, intermediate-range missiles capable of reaching most of East Asia, short-range tactical weapons designed for battlefield use against South Korean and Japanese targets. The regime had, through the September 2022 nuclear law, explicitly expanded the conditions under which it might employ these weapons, from pure deterrence through retaliation to a doctrine that included preemptive first use if a fatal military attack against important strategic objects was judged to be on the horizon. The transition from a nuclear strategy premised on assured retaliation to one that included first-use options was precisely the kind of development that the command and control vulnerabilities the officer had described made most dangerous. A state prepared to launch nuclear weapons preemptively on the basis of an assessment that an attack was imminent, and whose command and control system was designed to launch automatically in the event that the Supreme Commander's authority was disrupted, was a state that could, in a crisis involving misunderstanding or miscalculation, stumble into a nuclear war that no party to it intended. Western strategists and intelligence services used the officer's intelligence not to prepare for an inevitability, but to identify the specific points at which the risk of inadvertent escalation was highest, and the specific diplomatic or technical interventions that might reduce it. This was the practical value of the knowledge he carried, not to enable an attack on the nuclear infrastructure of the regime, an act that the automatic launch protocols would likely have transformed into a catastrophe, but to understand, with enough precision to be useful, where the danger zones were and how narrow the margins for error had become. There were other dimensions of significance. The officer's testimony was part of a broader body of evidence that was systematically challenging the dominant framing of the North Korean nuclear problem as a problem of a rational state pursuing a nuclear deterrent in response to credible threats to its survival. This framing, while not entirely wrong, obscured the extent to which the nuclear program served domestic political functions that were independent of external threats. The bomb was not merely a deterrent against foreign military action. It was a mechanism of internal regime legitimation, proof that the sacrifices demanded of the population had produced a result, that the ideology of self-reliance had been vindicated in the most extreme and consequential way imaginable. Understanding this internal function of the nuclear program was essential to understanding why diplomatic negotiations had consistently failed and would continue to fail as long as they focused exclusively on the external security calculus. A regime that needed the bomb for its own internal legitimacy could not trade it away for economic incentives, no matter how generous. The six-party talks, which had consumed years of diplomatic effort and occasional, apparent breakthroughs, had ultimately produced nothing durable precisely because they had failed to address this internal dimension. The officer's testimony, which included detailed accounts of how the nuclear program was discussed and referenced within the senior bureaucracy, provided evidence for this analysis that was more granular and more credible than anything that had previously been available. Part 9. The Living Archive. Today, the officer lives under a protected identity. The country that provided him asylum has not publicly confirmed his existence. The intelligence services that conducted his debriefings have not released transcripts. The analytical products derived from his intelligence remain classified. This is as it should be, both for his protection and for the protection of whatever sources and methods the intelligence agencies used to verify and extend his testimony. But the effects of his knowledge are visible in the public record, if one knows how to read it. The academic literature on North Korean nuclear command and control published in the decade following his defection is notably more specific, more confident in its descriptions of internal procedures and structures than what preceded it. The diplomatic positions of the governments most directly threatened by the regime's nuclear capabilities shifted in ways that reflect a more precise understanding of the specific vulnerabilities and constraints of the system. The cyber operations attributed to Allied intelligence services against the Strategic Forces Command's communication infrastructure in the mid-2010s demonstrated a targeting precision that could only have come from human intelligence of the quality the officer provided. He is not the only source. The community of defectors who have made it to South Korea, to the United States, to Europe, each of them carries a fragment of the picture. The senior North Korean diplomat who defected from the United Kingdom in 2016 with his family, a man who had served as deputy ambassador and whose testimony about the internal dynamics of the regime became the subject of a best-selling memoir, brought a different kind of knowledge. The perspective of the diplomatic elite, the daily reality of the court politics surrounding the supreme leader, the economics of the party aristocracy, and its growing dependence on markets it publicly condemned. His testimony that dissent within the elite was spreading, that control over the population was eroding under the pressure of information flows the regime could no longer fully suppress, complemented and contextualized. The officer's more operational intelligence. The former senior colonel of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, who defected and, operating under a protective pseudonym, gave interviews to the BBC describing 3 decades inside the state's intelligence collection apparatus, confirming North Korean responsibility for the 2010 sinking of a South Korean naval vessel that killed 46 sailors and for the shelling of a South Korean island that same year, provided yet another layer of the picture. He described from the inside the terror task force that the Supreme Commander had ordered established to assassinate enemies of the regime abroad, a detail that transformed what had previously been regarded as isolated incidents into the expression of a coherent policy. Each defector, each testimony, each piece of intelligence added to an archive that was slowly, incompletely, but unmistakably assembling a portrait of the state that those within it had never been permitted to see whole. The regime depended, above all else, on fragmentation, on the principle that no single person, no single institution, no single community could accumulate enough information to understand the system they inhabited. The defectors, by speaking, were reversing that fragmentation. They were making the system visible to itself and to the world. The officer understood this. In his debriefings, he had not merely recited technical specifications and organizational charts. He had described the human texture of the system, the fear that pervaded every meeting, the constant performance of loyalty required from every participant, the private knowledge of the gap between the ideology and the reality that every thinking person within the apparatus carried and could share with no one. He had described what it was like to know what he knew and to have nowhere to say it. And then, finally, he had said it. Epilogue. The unfinished story. The nuclear crisis on the Korean peninsula remains unresolved. As of the time of this narrative's composition, the regime has conducted no additional nuclear tests since 2017, though analysts assess that the underground test site at Punggye-ri remains operational and capable of supporting a 7th test on short notice. The arsenal continues to grow. The delivery systems continue to improve. The diplomatic channels through which a negotiated settlement might once have been achieved have been formally closed by the regime's September 2022 declaration that its status as a nuclear weapons state is now irreversible, and that there will never be any declaration of giving up our nukes or denuclearization. This is not a story with an ending. It is a story with a trajectory. The officer's intelligence did not solve the problem he illuminated. It sharpened the understanding of those who had to manage it. And managing a nuclear state whose doctrine has evolved from deterrence to potential first use, whose command and control architecture contains structural vulnerabilities that could produce inadvertent escalation in a crisis, and whose internal political logic makes denuclearization economically negotiable only at the cost of regime survival, is among the most demanding challenges in the history of international security. What the officer's story contributes to that challenge is not a solution, but a principle, that even the most opaque systems have seams, and that those seams are human. Every totalitarian state is run by people who know more than they are permitted to say. Some of them eventually find a way to say it. The accumulated testimony of the thousands who have found their way out of the hermit state, the farmers and factory workers and intelligence officers and diplomats, each carrying their fragment of the truth, constitutes the most comprehensive indictment of a political system ever assembled in real time by the people who lived inside it. The man who walked out with the nuclear codes did not end North Korea's nuclear program. He did not prevent the regime's continued expansion of its arsenal. He did not bring about the collapse of the system that created him. What he did was something more modest and more durable. He made the system legible. He turned the unknown known. He contributed, at enormous personal cost and at risks that can scarcely be imagined by those who have never lived, under a system where knowledge itself is a capital offense, to the human project of bearing witness. In the final accounting, the nuclear secrets he carried mattered less than the fact of his departure. Every defection from the inner circle of the regime is a crack in the wall of the system's self-presentation, proof that the loyalty it demands is not as total as it requires. The regime has survived many such cracks. Whether it can survive the accumulation of all of them together is a question that history has not yet answered. What we know is this: somewhere, in a city whose name is not to be published, an older man lives quietly under a name that is not his own. He has grandchildren, perhaps, who do not know where he was born or what he once knew. He reads the news from the country he escaped with, the attention of someone who has never entirely left it. And in the archives of Allied intelligence agencies, protected by classification levels that will not be lifted in his lifetime, the precise and verified knowledge that he carried across a border in his head continues to inform the contingency plans of governments that have still not found a way to solve the problem he so completely understood. That is the story of the man who stole North Korea's nuclear codes from inside. Not a theft in the conventional sense. No physical document was removed. No server was breached. No safe was cracked. The theft was of a different order. The organized, deliberate, and finally irreversible removal from the regime's possession of the one thing it could not afford to lose. Not the warheads, not the missiles. The understanding of how all of it fit together and where it was. Weak, and what it would take to make it stop.